ecologies of infrastructure. My name is Jakir Sangkamani from Faculty of Political Science, Chulalongkorn University here, acting as a panel convener. And in our panel, we have next to me here, Kasper Brun-Jensen. He will talk about his work on urban kaleidoscope, Chinese construction, scale making, and the redesign of Cambodian cities. And we have also Eli Elenov from Victoria University of Wellington. He will talk about his work, I think ongoing work on aggregate ecologies on the environmental effect of the city surfaces. And also we have Chaya Watanaputi from Department of Geography, Chiang Mai University. He will present his work on redefining, reimagining, and reparticularizing Thailand's climate knowledge, the case of climate actors, and that knowledge infrastructure. So without any further ado, I'll start with my presentation first and then follow by the other. So what we plan is that each speaker will talk for 15 minutes. And then after the whole speaker, the whole panel finish, then we'll have the Q&A at the end. Okay? So if you have questions or comments or anything, just please keep it at the end. All right, so my paper is on infrastructure in the making, which is already published, and so I would probably read out some of the content from my paper here. So my study explored the process behind the construction of Chao Phraya Dam, the first World Bank funded water infrastructure project in Thailand. And the project developed during the 1950s and 1960, also complete in 1957. In examining the process of turning financial and technical assistance into a workable project, I argue that the development infrastructure like Chao Phraya Dam provides a space to explore the dialectic operations, accommodation and resistance. This is from Andrew Pickering, of agency and the unstable association among diverse actors, expertise, institutions, and materials. I suggest that the dam, often portrayed as an engineering achievement of the state, is in fact the result of unanticipated relations and the responses to the temporal emerging forms of practice. So the initiative of the modern water development in Thailand began in 1902 when the Dutch hydrologist Homan van der Heide was hired by the King Rama V to study the feasibility of water management in the central plain of Thailand. Van der Heide later produced a report suggesting the construction of the dam on the Chao Phraya River close to China province. However, the government's need to divert capital to the construction of railways and other projects at that time put the initiative on hold. Another initiative resumed under the name Chao Phraya Scheme after the World War II. In the late 1946, Thailand Royal Irrigation Department, or the RID, came up with the 88-page feasibility report proposing a project that was significantly larger than the long laid-out plan proposed by Van der Heide almost 5 decades ago. The initiative suggested by the RID was that the project should begin in 1947, and at that time the RID had only 12,000 personnel and needed another 25,000 personnel for the upcoming work. Besides human infrastructure, finance also needed to be mobilized. In order to be considered a financial loan from the World Bank, the bank required an internationally recognized feasibility study of the project. The Thai government then put trust in its long-term ally, the United States, through the U.S. Bureau of Reclamation, or the USBR, to conduct the study. So the main purpose of the technical report was to justify the cost-benefit and ecological mechanism in order to ensure the project financial return. In addition to economic and engineering assessments, the evaluation also extended to the personnel and organizational considerations. This involved the expansion of the Thai bureaucratic organization and the setting up of the training school, especially on the hydrology. Following the loan agreement with the World Bank, the RID called for international bidding to select a capable contractor to supervise the construction of the dam. After a call, 9 companies engaged in bidding. In March 1951, the bidding selected JG White Engineering Corporation to be the contractor for the project supervision. The company was referred to by the RID selection committee as having great expertise in the construction of this and other configuration of dams, both in the United States and other countries. Aside from the bidding for the contractor, the RID also called for several bids for equipment for the dam construction. The call attracted considerable attention from various agencies, with as many as more than 1,000 companies engaged. In the end, 101 companies were chosen to supply machinery and equipment, including the companies from the United States, Germany, the UK, Belgium, Denmark, Sweden, and the Netherlands. When contract was to be signed between the RID and the JG White Engineering Corporation, the RID found that the company draft contract was highly unfavorable to Thailand. After a long negotiation with the company and in consultation with the World Bank, the RID refused to conclude the agreement with the JG White Engineering, the winning contractor, and instead start to negotiate with Kier and Quarter, the company that won the second place in the bidding. The Thai cabinet approved the new contract on August 1951. 4 days afterward, Kier and Quarter officially signed the contract with the RID. In order to mobilize all the human and non-human agency into concrete operation, a structural plan for the dam needed to be drawn up. The RID sought assistance from engineers from the USBR to supervise the layout and design of the project. Also, to comply with the loan condition, the RID contact the USBR in order to hire as a plant inspector. After the review, the USBR approved the plan for the dam design. However, the USBR strongly suggested that hydroelectric generators be added to the infrastructure, since it would yield a high rate of return on the investment and would create additional benefits for the construction of the dam. After the necessary financial resources has been mobilized, human resources prepared, and design structure revised, came the physical operation of infrastructural assemblage. This process of technical association, turning material and machine into concrete infrastructure, should be perceived as the most technical process of the project, and hence involve less conflict and resistance. However, things didn't go as expected. Dam technicality is always embedded in the politics and personalities of engineers. The first problem of many occurred a few months into the construction. The contract stated that Kier and Quarter would assign Frank Greenhoff, a chief engineer, to supervise the construction for the whole process. However, after he was stationed in Thailand, Greenhoff spent a great deal of time out of the country. What made matters worse was that one of the acting chief engineers was found to be in constant conflict with the Thai engineers. Besides personal conflict, there were also reports of other events indicating that Kier and Quarter engineer did not have sufficient expertise and caused great damage to the infrastructure. Numerous technical failures led to the questioning of the foreign engineers' presumed superior expertise over the Thai counterpart. This, I don't know whether you can read it. This is coming from the report that has been written by the Thai engineer. Of course, we cannot take it without question, but you can read it here. So 9 months into the conflict, which resulted in project delays. One of the RID head staff saw that this problem could not be left unsolved. So finally the RID proposed that Kia and Quarters and Thai staff take a paid holiday at the beachside residence for 3 months. Very good deal, huh? With all the expenses covered by the RID. So during this time, the RID would send Thai senior engineers to supervise the construction. If after 3 months, the results show that the Thai engineer were more capable of doing the work, this would serve as evidence that the delay in construction were due to Kia and Quarters' inability and not the laziness or inability of low-ranked Thai staff. If this turned out to be the case, the Director General reckoned it would be only appropriate that the company be the one to terminate the contract. In this confrontation, we have seen how the conflict between human agency functions through the mobilization and association of material and non-materials, such as discourse of professionalism, the condemnation of machineries, and the contestation of expertise. It depicts the entanglement between human agency that employ non-human agency as the source of their performance. So, in fact, in the paper, there's a lot of dramatic and controversial cases that I cannot bring in here because there are too many details. But overall, the historical account that I portray briefly here, also in the paper, depict the tendency of the development project to go beyond the authority and control of a single agency. The case shows that the perception of technical diffusion and development dependencies, portraying modernizing project of development as often being done in a unilinear fashion from north to south, obscure the process and agency of local struggle, mediation, and strategic intervention. The case of Chao Phraya Dam suggested a look into entanglements of ideas, people, relations, and materials in global local networks to create a hybrid form of engineering practice and infrastructure production. The case here reminds us that infrastructure is neither an achievement of the state engineering maneuver nor an important magical assemblage of technology, but consists of contingently dynamic, associated, and at the same time disassociated relation of different agencies. It is a result of technological and political engineering aligning and entanglement based on anticipated relation and action of dynamic agency. So that would be it. Thank you. Okay, so the next presenter is Eli, right? Okay.
Thanks, Ajahn Chang. If we're to look for clues about the dawn of the Anthropocene in Thailand, the year 1915 might be a good place to start. By 1915, Bangkok had begun its transformation from a city based on canals to one increasingly organized around roads. Indeed, that year canal construction in Bangkok ceased. During the same span, according to the economic historian Porpon Puyanon, several other canals, including Trok Dao, Nawari, Wat Taplu, Suan Luang, Wat Ko, Wat Tuk, and Chakrawat were filled in to build roads. The city walls and city gates were demolished in 1910 for building roads and also walls and row houses. As the city shifted from being amphibious towards being terrestrial, so too began a kind of radical turn towards hard surfaces. Also in 1915, Siam Cement's Bang Sue plant began its operations. In the first year of operation, the plant produced 20,000 tons of cement. Founded 2 years prior in a joint partnership between the Siamese monarchy and Danish industrialists, Siam Cement was created with the explicit purpose of creating a long-lasting and increasingly durable domestic supply of this critical material of modernity. In this paper, I ask and consider how we might construct a political ecology of cement that's capacious enough to take into account these varied and dispersed histories. Can we think about the ecology of cement beyond the dichotomies that either privilege highly localized effects of either quarries or projects on the one hand, or a kind of nether region of carbon-based accounting on the other? What does attention to cement and concrete tell us about large-scale environmental change anyway? And what can we learn about environmental change in Thailand and perhaps beyond? So before I dive into what are admittedly meaty sorts of questions, I want to throw out a caveat here. These are questions that center my current research project, which is my second long-term ethnographic project, exploring the kind of past, presence, and futures of cement in Thailand. And like any project in media res, I want to give the kind of disclaimer that this is all very loose and kind of unformed. So there's going to be a lot of raggedness here, so just hold on for what will be a kind of shaggy ride. So thanks for being patient. But what I'm interested in sketching out with this research anyway is a variety of sites, spaces, scenes, scales, and actors that are roped into kind of the creation of a hard surface city and what that says more largely about environmental change and planetary environmental change from the perspective of Thailand. So here I'll begin with a kind of short environmental history of cement, and then I'll get into a kind of more conceptual discussion of how I think cement operates as a kind of environmental material. Cement and reinforced concrete were initially taken up rather slowly in Thailand due to the fact that most of it needed to be imported. The first reinforced bridge, Sapan Charam Lo 55, was opened in 1908. As the production of cement and concrete expanded after 1915, a whole host of other social, political, and environmental consequences followed. The architectural historian Lawrence Chua has described, for example, how in an effort to support this emerging industry and also to counteract the influence of the mainly Chinese building industry and the kind of power of European experts, King Rama VI encouraged the use of material in a wide range of civic building projects, including temples, shop houses, and new public works like Ratchadamnern Boxing Stadium, the Democracy Monument, and Kuala Lumpur Railway Station. As Chua describes, the material limitations that cement posed actually ended up transforming older aesthetic styles and in the process generating a new nationalist architectural grammar that's really been fundamental to the way in which the kind of older portions of the city reflect nationalist imaginaries, modernizing imaginaries from the kind of early part of the 20th century. Later, in an effort to secure sufficient supplies of the material were necessary to create what was then the largest multi-purpose dam in Asia, the Bhumibol Dam. That project, over the course of its construction, required up to 250,000 tons of cement per year, and so it entailed the creation of a whole new cement company. In fact, the Chomratan Cement Company, which was underneath the Royal Irrigation Department. And that cement company was created with the explicit purpose of generating enough supply of the material for that major construction project. Concomitant to the founding of Chomratan Cement was the founding of the Mammoth lignite mine and coal power plant, which were used primarily, at least initially, to generate the electricity for Chomratan Cement's factory, and later also to fund what was the kind of air base, the US-based air base in Takli. So what we can see in terms of the convergence of the Chomratan Cement Company, the Bhumibol Dam, the Mammoth lignite mine, is the way in which these installations enact a kind of widening set of ecological transformations that wrap up concrete and cement production with other sorts of disparate effects, some of which are certainly atmospheric and some of which are quite situated. In 1958, the American Tudor Engineering Company in Washington, D.C., which was brought in on behalf of the International Cooperation Administration, a part of the State Department of the Cold War apparatus, brought in to assess the viability of supporting a planned extension at Takli, and they determined there was considerable space yet in the market to expand cement production, not only to support new public works, but also to kind of fund the kind of increasing urbanization in Bangkok. So you can see the way these dispersed processes had a way of enacting kind of spatial change in the city. And topographically, all of these projects had very important effects. As Ajahn John just described, the country's rivers were subject to a radical remaking as the construction of large dams, ostensibly in the aim of electrical generation to fuel industrial transformation, were also entailed in the mobilization of uplands populations as they were dispossessed. This involved the denuding of forests, both through the deepening penetration of road construction, and at least anecdotally, maybe somebody can confirm this for me after we talk, as the demand for plywood increased as a kind of basis for low-cost cement molds. This is something a botanist told me about the loss of dipterocarp forests in Thailand throughout the 1970s and 80s. Not to mention the kind of materially intensive process of limestone mining, which radically transformed areas around Saraburi, Lopburi, and Takli. Around the same time, the U.S. military began purchasing additional large quantities of cement directly from Siam Cement to build new roads and military installations as part of its wars in Southeast Asia. These these security roads, as John DeMoya has described them, were aimed at facilitating troops and acting as launching points for bombing raids. And so we can see the ways in which these militarized infrastructures that relied upon massive quantities of localized cement wrapped up kind of geopolitical changes within a kind of schema of transforming spatial and agricultural relations through the materiality of cement. It should be noted that by this time in 1969, the Siam City Cement Company was founded as a third large company in response to an ever kind of increasing growing demand for material. After the American withdrawal from Southeast Asia and the kind of pause due to the oil shocks, urbanization and economic transformation further increased cement production as new modes of dwelling and laboring throughout the country took hold. In Bangkok, for example, new high-rise apartments complex sprouted across the city. Some people point to 1987 as a moment in Thailand in which there was a kind of definitive vertical turn, which had a kind of material resonance in terms of the production of cement. In the provinces, houses which were previously constructed of timber, open to the elements, and often raised to accommodate periodic floodwaters, were increasingly built on solid foundations. Their open-plan ground floors filled in with concrete bricks, and in some cases, interiors cooled by air conditioning. TPI Cement was founded in 1991 in response to this growing demand. And in 1996, just on the precipice of what would be the Asian financial crisis, cement production hit an all-time high. During the Thai economy's boom times from the mid-1980s until the economic meltdown, the real estate market was in fact so hot that even as they were producing record amounts of cement, there were yet still shortages of this man-made stone. In 2011, the disconcerting interfaces between all of these hardened surfaces yet again moved to the fore as Bangkok and the surrounding areas were hit by historic floods. Suddenly it seemed as though everyone was aware of the way in which the river delta had become a tangle of what Atsuro Morita calls amphibious infrastructures, some of which sped the flow of water while others blocked it. On the one hand, the effect of the floods has been to prompt a kind of rethinking of the surface of the city itself, to propose these what I think are quite profound, speculative imaginaries of post-concrete cities. Whether they're achievable or not is a rather different question. On the other hand, as numerous scholars, Jerome Whittington, Atsuro Morita, Danny Marks, and myself have argued elsewhere, the floods, rightfully or wrongfully, prompted a return to engineered solutions to water management in the form of these large-scale flood walls. So despite the soul-searching, and despite all of this soul-searching, in 2016, cement production outpaced for the first time the pre-boom years. In a slight twist, we might say, on John Maynard Keynes' old quote, Thailand's economic recovery following the military coup was paying some people to dig holes and paying others to fill them with cement. Neither economic nor political history in Thailand have been linear. though the rapid expansion of cemented environments generally has increased across the 20th and 21st century, with obvious significant disruptions around World War II, the oil shocks, and the market crashes. If in 1915 Thailand produced 20,000 tons annually of cement, the country now produces upwards of 40 million tons. And that's just domestically, that doesn't include Thai cement operations operating elsewhere in ASEAN, which is another story altogether. So alongside this shift, we might also imagine the ways in which cement served as a host of other environmental transformations that have been fundamental to the rise of what we call the Anthropocene. Indeed, we've also seen a related rising concern about what all of this cement is doing, not only environmentally, but also ontologically. Who are we living in this environment? And here my project follows very closely the kind of way in which cement becomes a metonym for thinking about environmental change. So beyond those architectural renderings, I'm sort of taken by Thai artist Panapan Yokmani's work. This is from her piece, her massive room-size installation called Aftermath, which won the Singapore Biennale in 2017, which sort of details the kind of emerging sense of ontological minds and uncertainties associated with life amidst increasingly hardened landscapes. And what I want to emphasize here is not an easy answer. Like what Panapan Yokmani's work shows, this is well and truly a bind. So how do we begin to think about this? And what I want to do here is shift kind of to talk conceptually, just to conclude conceptually here, to think about ideas of collection, extension, intensification through a kind of broader framework of aggregation. So what I want to emphasize in this necessarily brief narrative is the ways in which the hardening of the land has been closely associated with an accelerating curve of environmental change. As Paul Virilio notes, the street is a producer of speed of all sorts. And yet, we might yet still ask how cement and concrete have generated that geological speed. And here I think, if we think about concrete as an aggregate that aggregates, to be cute, we can think about the ways in which this material, which contains cement, sand, water, comes to speed up and collect environmental change, in turn producing more of it. 60 to 75% of most concrete is composed of aggregates made of sand, crushed stone, and increasingly recycled concrete itself. Cement, the chief component of concrete, is itself a compound geological material that's made of limestone crushed and cooked, mixed with silica and whatever else to enhance the properties that whatever the engineer seeks to enhance. The difference between concretes, as I've been told repeatedly here during my work, is always in the mix. In this sense, concrete production is a process of collection, of material collection, and through combination, draws together situated transformations behind its own production, and when used, it extends ecological changes across disparate landscapes, leading to intensified transformations elsewhere. So aggregate ecologies are ecologies of collection, extension, and intensification. Thinking about cement in this way helps to reinforce the ways in which it is always a geological practice. By blending this materiality with water, time, and air, liquefied stone becomes a kind of solid built structure. And here the city reemerges, not simply as a scene of capital production or a landmark of uneven modernities, but as a geological form unto itself, which, like other ecologies, is a constituent whole of a whole set of environmental uncertainties which frequently exceed the grasp of any one expert. Attending to concrete in this way highlights the processes of collection, extension, and intensification that get lost in a simple carbon accounting, which is how both the industry and many carbon-focused activists tend to think about these processes. That is to say that the amount of carbon that cement is responsible for, which happens to be between 5 and 10% of global carbon emissions, is produced during the process of cooking the raw meal to make clinker, the mutated form of limestone behind cement. Yet such a narrow calculation fails to account for the kinds of concern the material generates. If the purpose of concrete is to act as the backbone of a kind of logistical modernity, creating the kinds of infrastructural surfaces, workspaces, dwelling spaces capable of sustaining modernity, then its ubiquity is perhaps even more, which in its ubiquity is kind of rooted in the way in which it becomes a kind of omnipresent material in the minds of citizens as they consider their place in the changing planet. Writing from the vantage point of Colombia, the anthropologist Michael Taussig composes a montage that brings together histories of cement there with histories of cocaine, by considering them both as twinned and related ways of generating speed. Tracing this line of thinking back to the Roman architect Vitruvius, who noted that by harnessing the four original elements, air, earth, fire, and water, humans created something like stone, but malleable, that could, in relatively short order, enable the production of new architectural forms. So by cooking stone to remake stone anew, humans generated their own sort of geology, and thus became incapable in many large and small ways of acting at the speed of Earth. The debate around the Anthropocene's golden spike, the geological marker that denotes when the epoch began, has been an important topic among stratigraphers who aim to locate with some precision the layer within the stratigraphic record within which anthropogenic transformations have taken place. This question is also a matter of intense debate among historians and social scientists who note that where the spike is placed will result in a specific claim to geological truth that will either reflect or obscure a number of socio-historical conditions that have been fundamental to the rise of this planetary moment. Archaeologist Matthew Edgeworth suggests something rather different, focusing our attention to what he calls the archaeosphere, a subsurface layer composed of urban infill, foundations, backfill tunnels, drainages, subsurface constructions, old streets, human-generated soil, and artifacts. And he argues that this will be the most obvious marker, this will end up becoming the most obvious marker of the Anthropocene. This layer, a good deal of it composed of cementatious construction, will come to mark the dawn of this new epoch. So thinking our ecologies with cement and its cognate concrete allows us to understand in rather precise ways how humans generated and continue to generate their own geological speed, turning mountains into streets and infrastructures, buildings of all sorts. Following the concrete in the Anthropocene compels us to consider the multiple sources, socio-political processes that generated the material's history, and to ask how they're transforming the planet in the present. To think of cement is, on the one hand, as Taussig reminds us, to think of speed and to think of aggregation. So within this frame, Thailand's history of cement narrates with some degree of clarity the anthropogenic processes of ecological aggregation, accelerating us towards unknown geologies to come.
Thank you very much, Eli. So the next speaker will be Casper Brun Jensen on the urban kaleidoscope, Chinese construction scale making and the redesign of Cambodian cities.
Without further ado, this is obviously going to be extremely schematic as well. Like Jeffrey, I have a paper if anybody's interested. I'm going to touch briefly on three interrelated topics. One is urban change in Cambodia, particularly in Phnom Penh, with a nod to Sihanouk Village. One is scale changes and ontological transformation, the topic of the panel here. And one is how that provides a kind of perspective on political ecology. All in 15 minutes. So the setting is Phnom Penh, primarily in Sihanouk Village in Cambodia, and more specifically post the 2018 election, it's the last summer, which is a period that has been characterized by particularly intense Chinese investment that can be broadly assigned to a mixture of two different things, highly interrelated nevertheless, Belt and Road Initiative and Chinese real estate speculation in the city. The perspective I adopt is not one of political ecology directly. It comes out of a science and technology studies focused interest in social technical networks, and what could be described as the design of cities is something that is ongoing, that is an event or a set of events in which many actors take place all the time. And combining that with a more perhaps anthropological interest in how people's own perspectives, viewpoints, or as you might say, horizons of understandings change as they are part of the changing cities in which they live or work. So on the one hand, as we're going to see shortly, building very concretely reshapes activities, and we've heard 2 presentations of that already. It reshapes the trails of the city, the ways in which people can move about, live, do their things, its spatial contours, in ambience of its neighborhoods, and so on. On the other hand, in the Cambodian context here, the unprecedented speed, intensity, and unpredictability of urban change has also led many Cambodians to change their own perspectives in the process, not least on their relations with the Chinese and what the Chinese, or who the Chinese indeed are, what kinds are they, what kinds of people are they. So the general perspective I'm sketching here is one in which urban transformation is an effect of the ways in which material flows and perspectival flows come to be interwoven in cities and redoing them. So prior to 2018, there was already very significant Chinese investment and also Korean and other forms of investment in Cambodia and in Phnom Penh in particular. There was already a very strong investment bubble. But after the election in 2014, which led to considerable social unrest and protests, due to the fact that that had happened in 2014, prior to the election in 2018, there was considerable worry. There was a slowdown because nobody knew what was going to happen with the next election. Were there going to be more protests? Might the opposition party win? In that case, what would happen? Might there be a civil war? Might there be a military crackdown? Or it was a very unpredictable and worrisome situation. As it happened, this was preempted by a series of things initiatives conducted by government, or orchestrated by government. The major critical English-speaking newspaper, Cambodia Daily, was shut down due to claims of massive tax fraud. There was significant social network surveillance of critical voices. There was very prominent gunning down of a political commentator, Kem Lay. The perpetrator was never found. He was shut down in front of a gas station drinking coffee, and it was said it was a drug deal, but nobody really believed that. And eventually the major opposition party itself was shut down by the Supreme Court as unconstitutional. So that basically quashed the democratic, the struggle for democracy in Cambodia. And the ruling party CPP won an overwhelming victory because there weren't any opposition anymore. So on the one hand, there were pretty much demolished democratic aspirations. But at the same time, this led to immediately intensified investment due to the perception from abroad that the political climate was now stable. There was nothing to worry about. So immediately after the victory, buildings everywhere, central city, Phnom Penh, were bought up and torn down. Everybody somewhere knew somebody evicted. Personally, I've lived in Cambodia for several years. I've had to move 4 or 5 times over 5 years. First because of adjacent buildings, building of which made it impossible to live there. Moved to a new Chinese building, it caught fire because it was badly built. Didn't dare to live there anymore. Anyway, the rest of the tenants were evicted and only Chinese allowed shortly after. Moved into a 3rd place, it was bought up by Chinese, we were evicted. Moved into a 4th place, it has not been bought up by Chinese. However, the neighboring slot of land has been bought up by Chinese. And thankfully, that was not a new high-rise, it was only a restaurant at 2 floors, so it was only like half a year of noise from 6 a.m., 7 days a week. So this is going on, this is not just my experience, that's the general experience. And of course, I'm privileged in Phnom Penh. People that aren't so privileged are just evicted and kicked out of the city. They can't afford to live there anymore, so they can't also work there anymore, and they're pushed to the ranges. And hence what I mentioned here is rumors and uncertainty among both locals and foreigners. So the city scenes we have here are, on the one hand, urban planning that is sketchy, plans that are not really followed, certainly not followed through. Money and under-the-table deals drives the processes, and the processes are ones that generate these kinds of massive high-rises that are, however, mainly uninhabited because few people can afford to live there, and generally perceived to be about the whitewashing of money because there isn't any regulatory oversight, and also about the conversion of not least Chinese yuan into dollars, again because there isn't any oversight, so you can buy in cash Chinese money and you can sell it in dollars a couple of years later. And this has been a good deal because prices have increased 5 to 10 times over the last 10 years, not just in Phnom Penh, also in Kampot, where the cement quarry we looked at just before this, and elsewhere. We are in a general ambience of noise, drilling, machinery, air pollution practically everywhere. In the city, it takes the form, as I've said, of demolishing older buildings and building new ones. At the fringes, you have gated communities springing up everywhere because it's sort of not already covered territory. Now, if we go very quickly to some of the viewpoints of this situation, you can contrast very broadly two sets. On the one hand, we have at the top here, this is Bruno Mackay, he's a Portuguese politician. He's not writing about Cambodia, but he is writing about a preview of the Chinese future. This idea of Chinese globalization, China taking over everything everywhere, and it'll create basically a new Chinese global world order, which is not, as he sees it, a very appealing thing. Similarly, in the more local context of Cambodia, this Cambodian city, that's Sihanouk Village, is turning into a Chinese enclave and not everyone is happy. And at the bottom, which you almost can't see, the important thing is not that a bunch of Chinese guys are sitting at the beach in Sihanouk Village. It is, if it's possible to read it, that Cambodia tells journalists, our Chinese future is a global trend connected to regional expansion and economic extraction and so on. But on the other hand, and this is the bottom one, there's also the claim from Chinese developers, of course, and politicians and Cambodians that this is about development and progress. Sihanouk Village, which is largely denounced by Westerners and critics, is described as a city of miracles by Cambodians. Perhaps the next Silicon Valley, and that's what the quote down here says. Cambodia tells journalists to present the hive of Chinese investment as a city of miracles, set to rival a mashup of Silicon Valley, Las Vegas, and Singapore. This is pretty far from the current situation, but it nevertheless shows the span of these kind of diverging interpretations, which are characterized in both cases, though they disagree, by having to do with large-scale political explanations, maneuvering economics, and installs a sense of historical rupture. And the contrast, I think, that I am working with here, and I think Japrit and Eli and Jaya are doing something similar, is to give a different, more sort of materialized and micro-scale image of how urban transformation is driven. So I would emphasize not the sense of determination from above by the Chinese, but emergent qualities at various scales and pertaining to various situations. They are clearly emergent qualities of the cities because they are really radically materially transformed. In some images again, a Chinese casino in Sihanouk Village, a demolished building at the new seaport, and also in the middle, the pumping of raw sewage onto the previously white beaches. Urban spaces are materially radically transformed. People's livelihood possibilities are being radically transformed. Ecologies and environments surrounding the cities are radically transformed. We have again the beach and the raw sewage coming from Chinese casinos onto Orchard Beach and the islands, which has driven away practically all Western tourists because it's getting dirty there. The waters, everything is becoming massively polluted. And again, also emergent qualities of who the Chinese are and their relations to Cambodia, in a sense that these perspectives have radically changed to the point where there's serious anti-Chinese sentiment in the country now. To summarize, I just have two slides with no pictures. I tried to evoke, at least very sketchily, a set of scale changes, rather than this conventional imagery of a nested hierarchy of scales where we have local people in organizations or cities that are meso, and then they are ultimately determined or structured by macro forces. We're witness to a set of mixed processes that generate scales. New scales of politics, what is China in the region, what is China in the world, what is China in Cambodia. New scales in how people imagine their relations to themselves and other Cambodians, inwards and outwards to Chinese, which also changes how they imagine their relations to other Baran, Koreans, and elsewhere, and how they act accordingly. Scale changes in terms of cities as something that are not planned and implemented, but perhaps designed, but then transformed and translated through a set of events as a continual process, as the Australian urban designer Tony Fry writes, from its moment of conception, due to the everyday major and minor additions that are made by everybody, not just the supposedly big actors, but also the small ones. So we see, for example, Sihanoukville itself has become bigger, like literally, but also in the regional imagination, because it now has a deep sea port, transport lots of goods. Maybe it could be the new Silicon Valley and so on. But its ecologies are diminishing because they're being destroyed, things are dying all around, and also the Cambodians in Sihanoukville are becoming smaller in the sense that 90% of business there is now owned by the Chinese. The scales are changing. So this is an image of urban transformation as a kind of kaleidoscope due to partially connected processes that involve material flows and people's perspectives as well. I think Cambodian cities are interesting because of what they make visible. Most of the time anyway, urban transformation tends to happen slowly, somewhat under the radar. So material changes often take the forms of silent transformations. The extension of chutes, pipes, the installation of new street lights, or the eventual but somehow expected replacement of dilapidated old buildings. Few pay much attention on a regular basis. And our own perspectives and horizons of understanding often also go unnoticed, sitting in the dark background of networks that can't be seen. So what's so fascinating about current Cambodian transformations is that both the material and the perspectival changes have simultaneously ceased being silenced. As new networks, buildings, fences, and walls materialize too quickly everywhere, the normally dark urban background has become plainly visible foreground. It draws everybody's attention, at least for the time being. The suddenly brightly illuminated foreground catalyzes new perspectives. Who we are in the world, where we are, how we relate to others. And it generates, in that sense, new rounds of activity and resistance, and yet new scale-making projects, together and against each other. They design the political ecologies of the cities. Thanks.
Thank you very much. So next one will be Shia Watanaputi from Chiang Mai University on redefining, reimagining, and reparticularizing Thailand's climate knowledge.
Hello everyone. I can assure you that I will not talk about concrete and buildings, but more on climates and climate change that we have already seen from Professor Isaac. So today I'm presenting you the different ways of how climate knowledge is produced in Thailand, coming from different perspectives, coming from different types of organizations. And I presented here to you on the left-hand side the perspective of scientists and academics. They see climate change as something that they need to study precisely. They need to keep updating, keep reporting, for it to be useful for policymakers. So that was the publication in 2011 and an IPCC-like report. And this information were used for the second panel there, which is the first ever Thailand Climate Master Plan, which was established in 2012. And their goal was for, at first, to educate people on what is climate change, and then slowly mainstreaming mitigation and adaptation into different provinces, and trying to achieve a low carbon society. So that's the 50-year goal from now. But in 2007, before these two publications were released, a venerable monk, a Buddhist monk, wrote a book called Hot World and Cool Dharma. In the event that at the time there was so much talk about climate change. And he said, actually, it's not only about science, and it's not about we knowing about greenhouse gases, but it should be us that need to, us as in our people, Thai people, should be rethinking about how we have to transform our society and our environment. He said, it is a moral change that we have treated nature as just a commodity. We need a new form of economy, a moral economy, rather than more economic growth, which somehow is contrasted to the Thailand Climate Change Master Plan, which aims for still continuity of industrialization and somehow achieving a low carbon society. So keep these three ideas in mind, and later on you may see some similarities with the type of organizations which I will present. And this morning, Professor Mehta already talked about climate change from a critical perspective, and so I will not repeat so much here, but I would like to suggest that climate change, from my perspective, is a knowledge that is produced, and it has a power relations, and it travels to different places and from different places. And as it meets with another places, knowledge clashes. Sometimes they resist, negotiate it, or conform. And my key arguments for this paper is that we have a different terminologies here. Climate change is something that is ontologically, linguistically, and experientially different from the word weather changes. And most of the time, academics or scientists or representatives of the government use the term climate change, and it's often removed from our cultural and place-based context. And it is something here which I argue that is one of the key barriers to how we understand and take actions at local level and national level as well. So, my question here is, how do different types of organizations in and out of Thailand try to help Thai people understand climate change? This morning, Professor Mehta classified them into the above, the middle, and the low group. I also did the same, but I had another axis. I have what I call the climate service providers, and these are the organizations that intentionally provide just climate data to the public. And one of the main actors is the Thailand Meteorological Department. The second one is what I call the climate policy facilitators. And they work with the intergovernment organizations and also bridging with the local governments. And the GIZ, the German part of government, the Office of Natural Resource and Environmental Planning, and a local municipality, they work together as one team in trying to bring the global climate change to a local development issues. And the third one is a more typical NGOs. I call them the climate story listeners, mainly because they try to listen to what kind of stories people have to tell. And these are international NGOs and local NGOs. So I will talk about how they produce and transfer knowledge to people. And I focused here in my research was in Nan province in northern Thailand. So I had a privilege to be able to sit and observe the work of Thailand Meteorological Department once they visited a village in Nan. Their goal was to deliver some climate predictions and also some climate knowledge. And this was the task commissioned by WMOs under the global framework for climate service. And it asked the Thailand Meteorological Department to go to different provinces to provide knowledge to people who are in need. So in that room, it was the atmosphere was almost like a lecture room. They gathered about 30 or 40 village elders. Most of them were farmers. Sat in there, and the technicians were talking about, oh, what is climate change? What is greenhouse gas effect? Everything was in highly technical terms. For example, the word greenhouse gas is the definition, the meteorological definition of what is hot days, what is stratosphere, for example. And they also show some similar diagrams like this to explain the greenhouse effect. And I felt quite sorry for the farmers because they did not have a clue what these experts were telling them. At the end, one of the farmers raised their hand and said, what do all this mean to my banana plantations, to my rubber plantation, to my rice? And people from the meteorological department didn't have the answer. And so it was almost like a job done for the technicians, but the farmers didn't take anything useful at all. So from the TMD's perspective, they wanted to inform the people that actually climate change is real, it is happening. And if you follow our predictions, you can perhaps take this information for begin your plantation maybe earlier or later, just in case drought happens or flood comes. Another form of machineries that were there, but in northeastern Thailand, was the automatic weather stations, and it's becoming quite popular amongst NGOs and also more science-oriented organizations. They want so much to install these machines in remote places for prediction of rain. I said here that they installed this machine, but the local people were there just only to receive the text message 2 days or 3 days in advance, though, if the rain would come or not, so that they could do something with their rice. But the thing is, the villagers became only the users, rather than someone who could collaborate or help validating the knowledge. And I interviewed one of the officers, and they said they didn't have the budget to extract local knowledge, or to somehow to combine local and scientific knowledge together, so that they have some co-produced knowledge. But later on in the second phase of the project, they asked the farmers to be trained in a kind of a workshop, but trained to learn how to use the meteorological mapping, or learn how to use simple climate prediction models, but not the other way around. So local knowledge was never part of climate service providers' idea. Moving on to the second group, this is something interesting as well. I was there to meet the people from GIZ when they came to Nan province, and they said to me that, climate change was happening, it's real, globally and locally, but Nan people, they didn't know about it. So our job was there as an expert, and to tell people that it's now happening and you should do something about it, or try to cope with it. And they presented this problem as a moral hazard, that Nan people were ignorant to this kind of problem. And another interesting idea was that, because it comes from a German government, and they were trying to bring the way that Bavaria state's climate policy that was successful to Nan province, because they believed that because these two places have a similar topography, so they expected that climate strategies could be similar. But as it unfolds, there were some barriers. There were 6 goals that GIZ wanted to achieve: urban replanning, flood management, waste management, biodiversity, green industry, and energy. But none, the officers, they were not so much interested in these, because they were facing a more immediate issues of haze pollution, of waste, of deforestation. And so they kind of almost abandoned the idea from GIZ. Even though these officers were sent to Germany to be trained, to do rounds of meetings and workshops and reading documents. So one of the GIZ officers, they said to me that it's because we have different mindsets, and so they didn't say that we failed, but that the project didn't took on and be successful. And so currently they're now doing the energy efficiency project. They calculate the potential that Nan province could reduce the amount of greenhouse gases. So it's yet to be assessed whether and how they will achieve that. And lastly, this is from a perspective of NGOs. And they have a different take of what is climate change. They said to me, one of the officers said that we need to train, we need to educate people about climate change. And it's not entirely about greenhouse gases. but so that people know that they're not to be blamed for the cause of climate change. And this comes after there was a case that one of the governors blamed one of the ethnic groups that they were the cause of forest fire, and they were the cause of flooding in the mainland and the lower areas. And so this group of NGOs wanted the local people to be able to demonstrate that they actually know about climate change, and they could claim that actually the governor's claim was wrong. And they did so by going to the village, and they said our method is not to talk about climate change at all, but to talk about the weather instead. And they listened to the village elders and tried to extract the historical oral history of what happens in the village, what happens to this particular trees, what happens to particular rivers and animals and productions and so on. And they try to build up maybe 20, 30 years of what climate change has happened. And so they do so in a way that climate change is only one part of a larger development issues in the form of amongst the issues of poverty, of inequality, of the incoming of seed companies and so on. But communities into a different directions. So what they have in common, however, and this is only one focus of my research here, is that all these these three types of organization, and only the climate story listeners were close to bringing the place-based knowledge into the global policy. But still, they haven't touched on the religious dimensions of the weather just yet. I don't have time to explain now, but maybe we can discuss that later. And so I will just end up the slides here. Thank you very much.
Okay, so thank you very much. I think we can sit there. So I think the floor is now open. Any questions, comments, please?
Just recently, we communicated about the climate change. It is sure that the pretty modern climate change, before it was old distance classic, and right now we are just more concerned about the modern climate change. Classic climate change and the modern classic change, I think there is a difference right now in 21st century. Shifting paradigm. So for that, main basic we have directly influenced by the political policies making, or the researchers, or the scientists who are more concerned on this topic. Just now, recently our professor spoke about that. So it is only a modern climate change scam, or just is a real climate change we are talking about this program?
Can you refer to the question again, please? The modern climate change and what, sorry?
It is a real modern climate change. And what is this happening? Especially we just talk about the climate change. What kind of climate change, like especially it's affecting the food sector, or is the air sector, or what kind of things is affecting? Like I'm from the Nepal, and the Mount Everest lies in the central core of the world. And from the main center, like main water source, hydropower is generated from the Mount Everest. So we are not concerned about the Mount Everest, and but we are concerned about what is that. So, and India is near touching a 17 borderline of Nepal. And we only especially focus. Why don't we look about concern about the Mount Everest as well? And even the food.
Yeah, I work with subsistence farmers, and they grow rice, different kinds of fruits. So their concern especially is whether or not they will have the rice for the next year, right? But when they never use the word climate change, of course, but when they interpret the term climate change, it means whether or not they could go to the fields to harvest, whether or not they can take showers more often or not, because they have less or more water depending on different circumstances. Whether or not they could go across the bridge because the storm is coming and more the lightning strikes. So if I may just show this briefly, my slides here. And they didn't talk about climate change as in a greenhouse gas emission, right? They talk about something from whether it's controlled by the spirits, or whether it's because of our moral hazard, or whether it's because it just happens. It was never interpreted from science perspective. So what they do, whether or not that rice is going to grow and they could harvest, it depends on different, the beliefs of different groups of people. Some of them would explain from animistic perspectives. So they would go and worship the spirit house. Some of them would explain it from Buddhist perspective. So said they would have a different ways of responding to changes. I'm not sure if I answered your question. Oh, sorry.
Thank you.
Yeah, my question is for really for the first three presenters on infrastructure. Looking at the title of this session, Ontologies of Infrastructure, I wonder if I could just invite you to tease out a bit more how you're conceptualizing infrastructure as opposed to built structures in general. Because when we link this to political ecology, the notion of infrastructure is something that somehow is providing something material that serves not just a single user, but the wider society, whether it's irrigation or roads or whatever. And when we bring that idea of how we delimit and define infrastructure, whether it's publicly or privately owned, to political ecology, I think it gives it a particular meaning. So I wonder whether, I mean, in particular, because I think that's more central to your topic, but also I think the other two more sort of concrete-based presentations may provide some sort of sharpening of how we're defining and limiting the term infrastructure and what political ecology then brings to understanding its social and political role.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Phil. I'm not sure whether I can sort of highlight the aspect of politics of ecology clearly here, but I'll try first. I think one of the key things about my case, Chao Dam, is that the infrastructure is considered to be something important, or how people set the priority of whether the infrastructure to be constructed or not depends upon their perception toward how ecology or resources should be used. In the case here of Chao Dam, as I mentioned briefly, that during the King Rama V, there was a concern that because the central plain needs to be managed somehow, right? And the concern came from the idea that irrigation needs to be improved in order to provide water for the rice production economy at that time. And it's also linked to the political transformation at that time on the institutional reform, the king and monarchy at that time as well, the abolition of the slavery. But then, even though the infrastructure itself has been put into the context and has been prioritized, but then it didn't come true due to another internal politics as well. What I mean is that the consideration for the security issue, the national security issue at the border, also another concern. That's why they have to balance between whether they are going to build a dam or going to build a railway. So that is one of the idea of how ecology, if you use the term ecology broadly, define the politics of how infrastructure is going to be constructed. But then the project has been revived after the Second World War, and that is also due to the concern not only within the country itself, but also the global production of agriculture that the United States came, and also the issue of the communist insurgency in the region as well, that certain kind of infrastructure needs to be built in order to expand the state intervention into the rural area. So I think there's some linkage between the ecology itself and also how ecology play out and or materialize into the infrastructure here. And in different contexts, it allows us to see that how infrastructure is being part of the ecology, and also when it has been built or complete, the ecology can be shaped by the infrastructure.
I suppose there's a number of ways to think about what we mean by infrastructure, whether it's those hidden socio-technical systems that Susan Starr talks about, or the kinds of political incitements, scenes in which publics come together to debate the kind of arrangements of space, time, nature, technology that Abdul Malik Simone discusses. In some ways, I may be more material. I mean, obviously, from my presentation, it's pretty clear I'm hyper-materially focused at the moment, and really concerned to show precisely the interface, precisely kind of at a most kind of geological and rudimentary level, the kind of earthiness of infrastructures at their kind of basis. I don't know if the quote comes from you, Casper, or from Hannah Appel, Nikhil Anand, and Akhil Gupta, but this idea of infrastructure, of nature being infrastructure, is infrastructure at some level. And so by tracing out these histories of cement, concrete, limestone, sand, water, kind of embracing the widening gyre of ecological aggregation, I'm concerned to show and to follow that stone into a variety of systems. Sometimes dams, sometimes roads, sometimes condos. And I'm stubbornly and perhaps stupidly resistant to narrowing myself at the moment. So, but I'm convinced and deeply interested in the kind of movement of stone. So, I don't know if that answers your question, but that's where my head is at.
Well, I think one thing it does, it has quite a nice counterpart to what Jack was saying. You're talking about ecology as infrastructure, as something which which we don't actually separate from the built environment in a way we can dualities. Whereas I think you're looking at ecology as a subject to infrastructure. And I mean, there are multiple ways in which we can engage infrastructure political ecology, but I think these considerations are really interesting, and when we talk about the two in the same sentence.
Thanks everyone for some very interesting and thought-provoking talks. My question is back to the question of infrastructure, I suppose. And everyone, or three of you, seem to be talking quite extensively about the emergent qualities of infrastructure, the kind of distributive agency that kind of your approach to infrastructure entails. So I just kind of like generally to get your reflections on how this distributive understanding of infrastructure might relate to the problem of violence. There's been work on infrastructural violence that overtly kind of questions, in such situations where there is breakdown or disruption of infrastructure, where we locate responsibility. So I know there's a lot of focus here on kind of the materiality of infrastructure, but I'm curious to know how the materiality, kind of this idea of embodied materials and technical objects, might segue into an analysis of violence. Thank you.
I don't know if I think it's a good question. It's a long-standing question. I believe Susan Lee Starr raised it years and years ago, basically saying, as you say, if you go with a view of distributed agency that doesn't center on a particular actor's intentions in an actor, an organization or a state or whoever is initiating stuff because the effects always sort of overflow, well, in that case, who will be held accountable? And I remember she wrote something like there's a kind of engineering approach that says that then you'd have to quantify all the actors and say each of them are like a 10,000th responsible for the death of that person. And she's on the one hand into distributed agency, but even back then she was saying, which obviously is nonsense. Right? I mean, so it's raising the question, but the solution is of course far more complicated. I mean, and I think if you look at, it's always, and it is complicated. I don't think you can center it. It's infrastructural violence is not like somebody taking a gun to your head in a direct way, right? But it is, nevertheless, I mean, if you look at the Belt and Road Initiative in Sihanoukville, I would like to say, and I am saying this is extremely distributed and decentered, and I don't think anybody intended Sihanoukville and Cambodia to be totally trashed the way it has been. Probably the Chinese engineers didn't intend it, probably the Cambodian politicians didn't intend it, but they certainly enabled it. I mean, so there's something about a switch from intention to what your policies and practices enable, I suppose. How to sort of give it more concrete shape, I think you'd have to be quite specific about it. But there's something about the enablement, all the stuff that has been possible to do, piggybacking on infrastructure and their policies and the money flows around that. With that said, I find that very, very important when you're looking at what is definitely environmental violence through infrastructure in Cambodia and many other places. But for my own work, because I think in a certain sense, the job of analyzing that level is pretty well covered by critical NGOs, by political ecologists, and many other fine scholars and activists. So I do think for myself that when it comes to this, and back to your question, that the key interest for me is that infrastructures, it is to study them consistently as distributed and complex and heterogeneous. And I think what we saw is, I think there's something of a difference from what Chakrit said, because he was talking about sort of bridging metaphors, bridging politics with ecology and so on. But I think what I'm saying about infrastructures and other sort of flows and materiality is that they're not just bridging stuff, they're redoing what we call ecologies and politics. Politics as a form is not the same in a mega city like Bangkok as it was in a tiny village, whatever, 800 or 1,000 years ago. Politics cannot be the same because of all these flows. What it means isn't the same, what it refers to and what you're able to do with it isn't the same. Culture isn't the same, it's changed through infrastructures, not determined, but changed through, and of course nature, so ecologies are radically changed. We've seen the pictures of that. What is an ecology is no longer the same kind of thing, and it's probably more or less impossible these days to find an ecology that isn't infrastructured in some sense. So people are even breaking down like now you talk about natural infrastructures, right? Or rice infrastructures, as Arturo Morita does, and so on. So it's not just a matter of bridging the concerns. I think there's a kind of complementarity or difference in orientation there. Bridging the political agendas, which are then often subsumed as Marxist or structurally determined in some sense, with ecology, which is given as a domain studied by natural scientists, biologists, and so forth on the other, and then you create a bridge between them. I think the more radical aspect of science and technology studies is to say, well, once you do infrastructures, you're redoing those domains. It's redoing the bridges and the links. They're no longer the same kinds of things, which creates pretty difficult questions pertaining to responsibility and violence that shouldn't be avoided. But I don't think they're solved by going back to the fixed domains. Nor that I don't think you were saying that either. But it creates these kinds of problems to see it in this way. But I nevertheless think it is a very congenial way of understanding these problems.
Thank you for a very fascinating series of presentations. I have a question for Eli. Your presentation brought back so much memories. I grew up in Surabaya and went to school in Lopburi, so I kind of know exactly what it's like, to live around cement sort of grounds. So I found the recent Bangkok panic around PM 2.5 very hypocritical because it pales in comparison to what the people in the provinces have endured for generations. I wonder if you can comment on, I guess, the local municipalities and the local construction industries, and particularly a very corrupt affinity between the two. In my past life as a governmental planner in Thailand, I remember looking through the local development plans. I remember them being heavily populated by cement-related projects. So I wonder, understanding your presentation, I mean, you focus on, more or less sort of, again, it's not your words, but more or less, these sort of centralized sort of system. But at the same time, I wonder if you can comment on like the local, there's almost a local emotional or affective fascination with cement in such a way that it gives a sense of materiality, tactility, that it seems much more, concrete, so to speak. So at the same time, I mean, these people, they own, in Sudbury where I grew up at least, these people, the local people, the local municipalities, they own construction companies at the same time. So how do you make sense of that?
That's a great question. One of the things that I think is apparent, I think, looking at the kind of political economy of construction, and I actually think it's all over Casper's paper as well, is the way in which cement becomes value, right? David Harvey's term, cement is frozen, or concrete is frozen capital, right? And you can see that precisely in general in the Chinese construction boom, but also in even wider terms in the kind of shift towards the kind of Gavin Chapman real estate economy, right? These economies of speculation, which are visible across Asia, not just Southeast Asia, but India, China, the way in which both state and also private capital could congeal into built forms. And in fact, I think that following Harvey, I'm interested in the way in which those political economies shift. And you can see it, in fact, who cement is for, in a sense. One of the things I've been tracing out while I've been doing this work is following the kinds of advertisements, the kinds of ways in which these companies imagine their consumer. And in fact, primarily up through the 1970s, one of the things that you see is that the market is based around a kind of image of state-led civic engineering. Images are largely big projects. By the mid-1980s and 1990s, those images devolve or tend to highlight a heroic, incredibly interesting figure of the migrant construction worker who is skilled in using cement on very low-rent kind of small projects by small local contractors. And finally, and most recently, and I think that this is evident, really, if anybody spent any time, or if you have any time while you're here to go to one of the more kind of hip cafes, the aesthetic of raw cement. Really close by, in fact, there's a place called Bangkok Factory Coffee below Payatai, below the airport railing, which is just an astounding cement landscape anyway, but the coffee shop is all raw concrete, adjacent to these massive pillars of the airport railing, which were itself a kind of white elephant. Anybody that's followed that project, it's a kind of well-known white elephant, something so overbuilt. So, I don't know how I got over there, but in any case, they have good coffee too. This kind of question of cement and corruption, concrete and corruption, are kind of, there's a long history of this relationship. And I think part of it has to do with the adjacency or the way in which the material comes to hold capital, whether it's state or non-state capital. And then the add-on to that is the fact that cement functions in two ways. One is it has the kind of spectacle of infrastructure, the arrival of development that's been noted since really the 1960s of a road coming in and being a kind of an achievement of the state. But also the counter-reading, and I've written about this a little bit elsewhere, so think about the ways in which people use the volume of a project, for example, to counter-narrate it as a site of corruption. Makassan Airport, the airport railing, is a wonderful example of how volume has been exploited again and again by people who wanted to comment on something that's essentially opaque, right? Like we can assume one assumption is to say that anywhere there's concrete, there's corruption. That's one assumption that people operate with sometimes. But the counter assumption is to read it even more specifically, to say, well, what are the volumes that indicate? Or what are the ways in which a kind of failure of a structure indicates something gone wrong in the process that's inevitably not so material or technical, but is political. And a third way that people tend to talk about it, and this is the kind of one that people, another good example of it is the old Hopewell rail line, is the obduracy of a material item, right? A thing that's stuck in place that never served the function that it could. So there's a lot of ways in which the material becomes read as an object or a mechanism or a modality of corruption that links this kind of the capacity to generate power and capital at various levels to these hyper-situated material effects. I don't know if that answers it. It's kind of a winding one, but yeah.
Hi, I really enjoyed your presentation. It was great. Thank you. So many complementarities with my own work and the work that I've done with colleagues. So I just wanted to ask you, did you manage to challenge the climate service providers and policy facilitators by taking the sort of place-based, weather-focused cosmologies, challenging them for that top-down, very colonialist way of dealing with the farmer, your China farmers?
For the climate service providers, I didn't have time to speak with them. They were very briefly actually. So, and then they gave lectures and then they left. I did ask them how and why did you choose this certain village? They also refused to explain to me. So maybe they have a secret mission going on. I did ask another officer, and I explained earlier that she said because of the budget and because of the criteria for the funding, that's why they didn't hire an extra person to kind of like try to bridge the knowledge of local knowledge with a more science perspective. And I did ask them whether or not they could include some of the local observations. They said yes, we could, but it's unpredictable. They said it may be only able to be relevant at certain times, but not every day for their predictions. And so they saw limited useful. Yeah.
They often say they can't really incorporate that knowledge into their models.
Yeah. And they said that okay, even though they have the good local knowledge, still they are facing something that beyond the magnitude that they have experienced. So they said it's not worth trying. Yeah. And for the climate story listeners, I talked with them a lot, and I was involved with one of the workshops as well. And their protocol was to really spend time with local people. So by asking the rain patterns, the level of water bodies, the behavior of plants and animals, and so on. But as I mentioned, they didn't go into a much deeper cosmological beliefs of what is climate, of what is weather changes. And that, for me, is a real shame because there were so many different ways that people try to explain weather changes through spirits and through normal observations. Yeah, so that project ended abruptly because they had to be doing something else. And Joe was quite busy. But the third phase, which is ongoing, that might be something that they're trying to do.
I think we are a little bit running behind the schedule already. So thank you very much for coming for the panel and enjoy your lunch. Thank you.